most notable geographic feature of the North or South Atlantic Ocean would definitely be the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the North American and Eurasian plates, and then extending down into the South Atlantic, the South American and African plates diverge to create the ocean ridge, which stands at 2 to 3 kilometers depending on where you are. That's from the ocean floor. As the mantle is rising to the surface of the crust and widening the Rift Valley, you can see seafloor spreading occur, as well as the production of basaltic volcanoes. Also found on the ocean floor are magnetic stripes in the rock, which are due to the Earth's occasional switching between magnetic fields, which it does every long time or so. And that transition is from either a normal field to a reversed field or vice versa. I don't know what those fields are. I don't know what that means, but that's what the Earth does. A little fun fact for you guys is that the North American, Eurasian, South American, and African plates are currently spreading apart at a rate of about 0.2 meters each year, which is about the rate at which our fingernails grow. Moving on to tidal patterns, it's important that I make the distinction between tidal or surface currents and deep water currents because they are different even though they do interact. Tidal refers to the rise and fall of the sea level on land, and that does, react with the movement of the currents in the deep water as well as the shallow, creating surface currents. And those have less to do with the motions of warm and cool and dense and less dense water, more to do with just plain old physics or something like that. As you can see on the map, the tidal currents kind of create a cyclical movement going counterclockwise throughout the entire basin, and I noticed how tidy it looks because it's trapped in this little confined bit to itself between the equatorial countercurrent and the west wind drift, and then, of course, on either side, the South American continent and the African continent. The ones worth knowing, the currents I mean, are here on the map for you to see, but I think you should know that there are these combinations and intertwinings of the major ones that create these new, smaller, weirder currents, and there are so many that I couldn't keep them straight, so I found a simple graphic, and I went with it. But take note of that. The predominant type of tide, and I don't entirely understand this part, is called semi-diurnal. Yeah. Which means that there are two high tides and 2 low tides per every tidal day, which is a little longer than a solar day. Solar day? Yeah. I think it's 24 hours and roughly 50 minutes. The map does display the role of temperature in deep water currents, which you can see in the red and the blue arrows representing warm and cold. I just thought that was worth noting because, like I said, the two features of these currents do interact in places. Moving on to historical uses, there are actually records of the studying of the tides by British monks? European monks. Of the tides of the Atlantic from as early as 600 AD. I thought that was really cool. And somehow they also grasped the concept of the sun and moon having to do with the tides, which, yeah, that's cool. Anyway, the Atlantic has pretty much always been the most popular ocean for fisheries. Historically, it's always been overfished, unfortunately, to the point that while the global marine catch increased over time, the Atlantic's yield actually remained the same, like it had already hit the ceiling. And many fish and plant species, as a result, are on the brink of collapse, or are already extinct. That being said, right now, as the rest of the globe and their marine catch has started to level out, the Atlantic has also started to decrease to 1/5 from 1/2. Since the 1960s, there have been these massive deposits of petroleum and natural gas found in the seafloor of the Atlantic Ocean. People also mine sand and gravel, and I believe ground shells. And those are used in landfills, construction, and concrete. A few other uses would be the obvious ones: recreation, trade, and transportation.
The most prominent feature of the South Atlantic Ocean's ocean floor is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge that runs down the middle, with many smaller ridges running along the southern areas of the ocean. Additionally, the coastlines are relatively smooth, and there are wide abyssal plains surrounding the Western African and South American coastlines. Again, the shorelines of the Southern Atlantic Ocean are the West African coast and the Eastern South American coast, and they have longer, less abrupt abyssal plains leading up to the shoreline. In terms of the predominant weather patterns of the South Atlantic Ocean, the primary ones are western winds that extend from a latitude of 40 degrees to the Arctic Ocean, creating an anticyclone along with high pressure areas at around 30 degrees latitude. And what this anticyclone does is it leads to the movement of southeast trade winds, which meet northeast trade winds near the equator in the intertropical convergence zone. And basically what that is it's a convergence zone that has a lot of rainfall and of a very high temperature, not only because of the fact that it's near the equator, which means that there's more sunlight shining upon it, but also because the interactions between the cold winds and the warm temperatures create this kind of weather pattern that leads to more clouds and overall more coverage around that area.
Okay, so for surface currents, they correspond to wind patterns. They are influenced by regional differences of heating, cooling, and Earth's rotation. And some surface currents include the Brazil Current, the Benguela Current, and the South Atlantic Current. Moving on to deep water currents, they are deep and bottom waters that contain high oxygen content due to rapid circulation, and the currents correspond to many of those of the North Atlantic Ocean currents. Global current is a moving system of deep water currents that are driven by salinity and temperature, and deep water currents of the South Atlantic include the Brazil Current, the Equatorial Countercurrent, and the Guinea Current. Moving on to surface temperature, the surface temperature is very closely related to the surface currents. And there is a drastic temperature change where the Falkland Current and Brazil Current meet, and where the Labrador Current meets the Gulf Stream. Canary and Benguela currents carry cold water to the equator, and in the tropics, surface temperature is controlled by climate factors. And closer to the equator, water gets warmer and cools as it moves north.
Various people of the Mediterranean ventured into the southern Atlantic before 600 BC and engaged in some transatlantic voyages as early as 8545. And also, the European discovery and its settlements in the Americas and in the Caribbean began in the late 15th century and lasted for around 200 years and more. And in 1492, the Italian Christopher Columbus, an explorer, crossed the Atlantic in a Spanish-backed attempt to find a new trading route to Asia. And instead of finding a new trade route, he became the first official European explorer to land in the Americas. And moreover, it is believed that the first Europeans to travel the Atlantic were the Norse, otherwise known as the Scandinavians or the Vikings, traveling west from Greenland, where Eric the Red had founded a settlement around the year 985, and in the year 1001 his son Leif is thought to have explored the northeast coast of what is now Canada, and he spent at least one winter there. So the Southern Atlantic has a lot of resources, and its natural resources include petroleum, gas fields, fish, and other marine mammals such as seals or whales, sand and gravel aggregates, placer deposits, polymetallic nodules, and precious stones. And the value of these resources represents the vast majority of all of the Atlantic's non-renewable resources. And In the southern Atlantic, it continues to provide millions in tons of fish annually for human consumption and industrial purposes. And for many years, the Atlantic's major fishing grounds were the most productive and most heavily utilized of all the oceans. And for some time, many Atlantic species have been intensively fished, and some key populations are thought to be extinct. And while the total global marine catch increased steadily over the second half of the 20th century, the Atlantic remained fairly constant. And consequently, the Atlantic's overall marine catch dropped from the more than half in the 1950s to about 1/5 by the early 21st century. Generally, tropical cyclones, otherwise known as hurricanes, develop off the coast of Africa near Cabo Verde, and it moves westward into the Caribbean Sea. And usually these hurricanes can occur from May to December, but they're most frequent from August to November. And in the Atlantic, the ocean conveyor belt is known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or the AMOC for short. And in the Gulf Stream, which is a wind-driven current that brings warm water northward along the US coast, it's very significant and it plays a big part in it. Scientists are saying that rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere has affected the AMOC and it's slowed the redistribution of heat in the North Atlantic. So waters along the northeast continental shelf began to warm up. So the Gulf of Maine has warmed faster than 99% of the global ocean over the past 10 years, impacting the distribution of fish and other species and their prey. And that also affects the southern end of the Atlantic, and the circulation of the deep, cold water near Antarctica may also be in trouble and vulnerable to disruption because of this.